Hi, I'm Peggy Singelman, host of Virginia Homegrown, and in the first half of our show, we'll be learning how to bring the outside in by gardening with terrariums.
And I'm Pat McCafferty. In the second half of the show, we're heading to the tropics, to Barboursville, Virginia at the Orchid Station, where they're growing stunning and long-lasting blooms. We love answering your garden questions, so go ahead and send them in via Facebook, phone, or email. And stay tuned for Virginia Homegrown.
Funding for Virginia Homegrown is made possible by Strange's Florist, Greenhouses, and Garden Centers, serving Richmond for over 75 years, with 2 florist shops, 2 greenhouses, and a garden center, located throughout the metro Richmond area. Strange's, every bloomin' time. Wild Birds Unlimited, providing bird food, feeders, and garden accessories. Products to enjoy nature in your own backyard. New location next to Wegmans in Midlothian, and also at Pump Road and Three Chopped. And by the Nanchard Morganson Charitable Fund.
The sun is shining and things are starting to grow in our gardens, and we are so excited for a new season. I'm Peggy Singelman, and welcome to Virginia Homegrown.
And I'm Pat McCafferty. In the second half of the show, I'll be taking us to a mini tropical paradise at the Orchid Station, a family-owned orchid business in Barboursville, Virginia. We can't wait to hear what garden questions you have for us, so go ahead and send them in via our Facebook page or on the email or the phone number listed on your screen. So Peggy, you're taking us somewhere. Where's that now?
We're going to be going to the Museum District in Richmond, Virginia, and we're going to be learning about how to garden inside with terrariums. So let's get going. You know, Karen, I love the fact that houseplants are making a comeback, and I thank you and Steve for having us and sharing us with everybody. Sort of a fun take that you have on these. You know, Steve started with aquariums, and now he's gone to land with these wonderful terrariums. So what can you share about them?
Well, as the aquariums got bigger and bigger, we had small aquariums to deal with. And so I don't know which one of us thought it up, but we decided, well, let's try some plants in there. One of the reasons was we have 3 adopt-a-cats, and anybody who has cats knows that they love to eat plants.
Yes, they do.
And so this was for their protection and the protection of the plants.
Yes.
And also, we were very busy when we first started this, and these have turned out to be such low maintenance and easy care ways to have greenery in your house. We basically buy plants according to how they look. This is a blue foliage next to a red foliage, a variegated leaf next to a shiny green leaf. So there's lots of contrast and interest because you don't have much blooming in terrarium plants. You just have, you know, texture and form.
You've got the one back here with all the tillandsias in it.
Yes, the air plants, there's many varieties we found out, and they just require misting because they're native to living on trees under the canopy of forest or jungles maybe. And so they are soilless plants, and that makes it even more low maintenance for people that are busy with their lives but want to have plants in their house.
Well, this room is so calming. You've got the aquariums, and then you have this lovely green, and I love, truly, you have created a display here out of these terrariums.
Well, it's just like any landscape plan or design or any art form you would have. You just look at the forms of the plants, the colors and how they contrast, the verticality, the horizontality. It makes the picture. It's just wonderful to sit here in the morning with my coffee and look at these little landscapes.
Oh, I love them. I do, and they are. They're, to me, each one of them is a work of art. The fun part, though, is putting them together and then also taking care of them, tending to them. And you've put together a great little how-to inside. So
it is pretty easy.
It is pretty easy. So let's go learn your secrets, okay?
Sure.
You know, Karen, terrariums really are a pretty inexpensive hobby. I can see what's on this table is nothing high-tech here. So talk to me about these wonderful tools.
Well, really, the lighting for the aquarium is just a T5 tube lights, and then Steve is trying this compact fluorescent, which is so economical to run.
Yes,
But you don't need special pruning tools. We use just a paintbrush to clean off the foliage. We plant with a house spoon.
I love that trowel.
It's small enough that it fits.
Yeah. And then I see over there, you know, basic, simple fertilization, and you know, you've got the spray bottle filled with water.
We like to use, he switched over to using spring water rather than the city water because it's got minerals and it doesn't have a lot of chemicals in it, and it seems to stain or spot the glass less than using tap water. Tap water worked fine for a long time though, so there's nothing wrong with just using tap water.
Right. But it's interesting that you mentioned the glass to keep the terrarium clean, so you can enjoy it more too.
Yeah.
And then
Less work.
much less work. But plants do come from nurseries and greenhouses with some insects at times, and nobody's perfect. And I see you're using, you know, the insecticidal soaps.
Yeah, this is the best because, of course, it's safe for the house and for the animals in the house. You can move it with your hands around the leaves and take care of things. It's worked very well for us. We don't get many insects, but once in a while you get something.
And one way you can also do that is when you get your plants in is you can rinse them off underneath the sink to just take some of the adults off,
Yeah.
if you're concerned about that. But the interesting thing too I see is you've got some fun things such as this, you know, wood here. And then you have very high specialized soil over there.
Well, it's really important to use that soil that's sterile. It doesn't have to be, you know, this particular one. But if you don't use bagged soil, you're likely to get weed seeds in there, and the weeds will grow much faster than the plants that you put in.
Don't they always, no matter what?
Yes. Now, the accents that we've used in most of the terrariums is left over from the aquariums, and it's this African bogroot, which you use in an aquarium because it's very heavy, it doesn't float. But it also comes in such interesting forms that it really works well against the green of the plants.
Oh, I like that. I wish I had a bigger version of that for my garden.
I know, driftwoody.
But just like we have different themes out in our gardens and our landscape, you have different themed terrariums here throughout. And so tell me about some of those. Some are younger, some are older, and some are a little more focused.
Well, the terrarium that we use in our foyer for the foyer light is probably the oldest planting. And so it's very solid, but lots of different textures. One very mean plant in there, an agave. So we won't get any more of those.
Yes.
But the textures and the forms in there are really interesting, and it's more a desert look. It also has a lot of the bogwood in it.
Okay. And then I know you have another one where you've got some pretty little blossoms going on right now.
The tillandsias are really interesting plants, and they're air plants, I think, or sky plants they're called sometimes. So they're green, and then they start to color. Each plant colors up a wonderful rosy red color. And when you see that happening, you know that it's about to bloom, that particular pup. And the flower is like an electric purple. It's really cool.
That's so fun. Who would ever think an aerophyte could be so fun to look
I
at?
know.
Something different.
So it gives a little change, like seasonal change outside. You know, you have some change in color and blooming inside the tank.
And I think that's the whole point of having these beautiful terrariums in our homes, is it gives us something to engage with, to look at, to be able to put some green in our homes once again, because we need to have those plants. Helps with the air.
Yes, air quality.
Very important for air quality. Protects the cats.
Yes.
And it's not a complicated, you know, adventure to start off on.
No, if you long for houseplants, I think this would be the easiest way to go. You know, you can even just have a single plant and highlight that, or you can have a ground cover. You can have some of those little fairy garden accoutrements and have little landscapes.
Yeah.
It's just fun to play with.
That sounds like fun. Well, I thank you so much for having us and sharing this. It's just been a joy to talk with you about these terrariums.
Thanks.
Karen and Steve were so kind to have us at their home and show us their terrariums and their aquariums. But being the horticulturalist Karen is, she did provide a complete plant list of what's in the terrariums, and they're on our Facebook page for you to review in case you're interested in copying some of those beautiful compositions she made. But also, we'd like to remind you to send in your gardening questions via Facebook, phone call, or email for tonight's show, and maybe we'll get a chance to answer them all. If not, we'll answer them on Facebook. So, Art, We're excited. We're going to talk more terrariums because we just saw one version of terrariums, and then there's a whole nother version as well.
That's right. The orchid terrarium is in a league all its own.
It is. Well, orchids are in a league all of its own, which is
Yes.
what we're going to learn more about later on today. But this one here, you've got this more open terrarium where Karen's were more enclosed. So
That's
please
true.
Tell us about what we have
Well,
here.
the orchid terrarium starts with the orchid. And so for an orchid terrarium, we need a nice, compact, long-lasting flower. 3 months, that's in a small pot that can fit in these small spaces of a terrarium.
Right.
And the top can be open because we want some fresh air, we want a little bit of humidity to escape, we don't want any kind of rotting to go on. So we don't need to close it in, plus it allows all the whimsical stuff to come out, the curly willow and the little mosses.
All the little decorative items that you can put in to have
That's
fun
right.
with.
That's
Yes.
right.
But what about the drainage and stuff? Because orchids do love all that lush, moist air.
That's true.
That are found in the tropics. But in the terrarium itself, you've got many layers here. So
Yes, well, we found that the humidity really stays in when you enclose an orchid in a glass jar. So it doesn't have to be watered anywhere near as much as your normal orchid. So we'd water it once, and then the water would sort of trickle down in there, and it would slowly come out. It would condense on the sides and run back down. And you'd have the cycle of vapor in there, and the orchids just seem to thrive in that.
kind of our water cycle from elementary school
Much
days.
like that, yes.
Much like that. But you've also got different sizes of you know,
Yes, so we start
stone in
with
there.
thick rock at the bottom, and then we have a smaller rock, sphagnum moss, and then a layer of green moss right out of your yard. And that makes a terrarium. It's fairly simple.
That sounds wonderfully simple and very successful because I know that you brought these in and that you've had them in existence for a little bit of a time here.
That's right.
So, but this is great. So demonstrating one, I see you've got some of the rocks that are over here and you've got
Right.
some of the materials over there. So is there a difference between the size of the rocks that we want or, you know, in our choosing and trying to figure out how to layer this?
Well, the user has complete control over how they want their terrarium to look. Usually it's big rocks on the bottom and then smaller and smaller as it works up. And you can use different colors, you can vary it, different textures. We top it all off with peat moss. And peat moss is a fairly common gardening item here. It holds some moisture. But we even prefer something looser than that, sphagnum moss. And this is a great, great material for orchid. In fact, most orchids today are grown in sphagnum moss. So it holds water well, and it's really the best thing for plants right now.
And particularly in a terrarium. Well, we've
Yes.
got parts and pieces, so let's start putting one together. How are
Okay.
you going to fit these orchids in that
Well,
container?
that's the question.
It's kind of like the ship in the bottle
We've
question.
got this huge thing. It is like a ship in the bottle.
Yes.
Tell us about this jar, for example. This came from your long-lost relative?
Yes.
Well, this is not easy to work with.
I gave him a challenge.
Yes. We preloaded it with rocks because trying to get rocks and flowers in at the same time is not going to be easy. So let's take a little Phalaenopsis orchid
And a little.
and a little Anthurium
Anthurium.
for some color. These two are complementary plants that grow side by side in the jungle. We're going to try to thread the needle, so to speak, and slide it right into this very tricky opening.
That's perfect for your hand, Art.
Yeah,
See,
yeah,
I
yeah.
told you this would work well.
Only skinny people can attempt this. Then once we have them squarely on the bottom, we lift it up,
And do a little wiggling.
a little wiggling. Are we off center a bit?
Yeah, we are. But,
Okay.
But, you know, small hands do help.
Small hands, right?
How's that?
That's good.
Is that good?
Let's spin it around so we
A little
see
crooked.
both plants. That's
You'll fix
nice.
it.
So that's our base, the solid rocks. Now we're going to add another layer of rocks.
Okay.
So we have lots of choices. This is a nice, very fine grade, and we sort of sprinkle this down in.
How much do we put down? Usually about an inch, or is there a
Maybe,
proportion?
maybe an inch.
or-
There's no specific quantity. We're just trying to cover the big rocks with little rocks.
So we can cover the large voids so that the moss doesn't go down through it? or-
Exactly, exactly.
Because I know with those large voids with those large rocks, I'll turn.
That's perfect.
Okay.
So you know, the first orchid terrariums were the Wardian case
Yes.
back in the 1800s, and collectors would make their own little vignettes in their homes and compare them to one another, and it was a big thing. and now they're back in vogue 150 years later.
Isn't it great?
Isn't that crazy?
Yes. For those people who don't know, Mr. Ward was a plant explorer, and he's the one who figured that if he enclosed his cuttings within a glass case, sealed them up, that they would make the long journey back from wherever he was to his home in England.
That's right.
And the horticulture industry exploded. So, and I see that very fine high-tech tool that you have
High-tech
there.
tool, it's called a stick.
Yes.
And we sort of work the pebbles around.
Okay.
Now we're
Alrighty.
ready for the next layer.
Yes, we need to move along.
So sphagnum moss is our next choice.
Okay.
Look how it just
Pull some
pours
out.
right out of this jar.
Yes. The laughter you might be hearing is our studio audience. We have a live audience tonight to celebrate the new season. So
we'll put a blob in there
Mm-hmm.
and a blob over there, and
And
then
we
we sort of tap it down in.
Okay.
Once again, this really is rocket science.
I can see that. I can see that.
And then we would continue all the way around until we had a nice layer.
Okay.
Now we're ready for the moss.
Okay.
The top moss, and this comes right out of your yard. And there's so many different kinds of mosses.
big
You've had the
job.
moss lady on before, right?
Yes, I have. Nori Burnett.
There's
She's
what,
been here.
200 different kinds of
Yes,
mosses?
there is.
This is a nice thin one with very narrow substrate here. And
With the
it's-
technical term of moss.
Yes, yes, yes. And so we would go around the terrarium in this fashion.
And finish it up with a nice layer of moss.
That's right.
When do you water it?
Well, watering takes place with a device such as this.
Mm-hmm.
You pump it, and you turn this thing on its side, and you squirt right in.
Okay.
And that water will stay in there for weeks. It sort of evaporates and condenses back down. It's a great thing.
Great little device to be able to hold that orchid and to provide that moisture needed.
That's right.
Some people seal their terrariums.
Yes.
You know, real briefly, would that be a wise thing to do with orchids
You
or
could
not?
do that. You do run the risk of the
Rot.
vapors rotting the flowers. Here, the shorter ones allow the flowers to pop right out. But it's really a trial and error thing. You can put it on, take it off.
Mm-hmm.
They grow in 100% humidity in the wild.
Yes.
So we're recreating that here with this terrarium.
And for people like me who have killed more orchids than I care to admit, and it's true, I think this is a great way for me to be successful.
Yes.
Only as the horticulturalist, I would add more complementary plants to it.
Well, yes, if you can get them down in there.
Yes. So Art, thank you so much in coming and showing us how we can put together a terrarium
My pleasure.
with a lovely, lovely example of an orchid.
Thank you.
And now let's go to the plant of the month.
My name is Ben Kessler. I'm the nursery manager here at Farfields Farm Nursery. We grow local genotype native plants, which we start from seed gathered in the fields and farms around us, and then propagate here in the nursery for home gardeners, retail nurseries, and landscapers all around the area. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite grasses. This is Alimus hystrix, or Bottlebrush Grass. It grows in the wild in riparian areas along streams next to other trees like pawpaws and walnuts and sycamores. Grows in the partial shade and the full sun alike. Gets about 3 foot, 4 foot tall, I'd say, at the maximum in late summertime. Starts up green in the late winter, early summer, then evens to a beautiful, lovely bronzy color through the late summertime, puts on a spray of spiky seed heads in late summer that stays and provides really nice winter interest all through the winter time. It's a really good plant to have for your pollinators in the area, though it does not produce pollen and nectar on its own. It provides habitat and hiding spots for your native bees and skipper butterflies and all sorts of other beneficial garden and lawn-friendly critters. So it's a great plant to have to plant alongside maybe you got a shady spot along the woods or the edge of your garden or the edge of your lawn. Really no muss, no fuss plant, fairly drought tolerant, tolerant of high rains and heavy winds as well. What I recommend most folks do for this or any plant really is water it daily for the first week, weekly for the first month, and monthly for the first year, and then you'll have a plant that will take care of itself indefinitely. Alimus hystrix is hardy, beautiful, a great companion to your neighboring critters in the landscape. And all of those are reasons why I chose this for Plant of the Month.
It's always fun to try new and different plants, and that's why we try to feature them on the Plant of the Month, so you can expand your plant palette and add them into your landscape or garden. But we've got a lot of wonderful questions here. And Art, we've got one right off the bat from John of Chesterfield, and he wants to know, how do you really water that terrarium without any drainage? And to make a note, that container had drainage, but I plugged it up with an epoxy type substance. So
Yes, most terrariums will be solid on the bottom. We want them damp all the time, but not sitting in water. So you sort of periodically put your finger in there to see if it's damp. If you think it's dry, you just use that hand pump sprayer and squirt a little bit in and just let the dynamics play out.
yes, and just that water cycle like we mentioned.
Water cycle.
Good old evaporation, condensation, and water will roll back down. Thank you. Pat, we have a question from Jennifer through Facebook, and she wants to know, what are the easiest vegetables to grow in a large container on a deck?
Oh my goodness, so many. There's no mystery to why people choose tomatoes and peppers. They're classics. They do really well in containers. One different one, though, that you might want to try out are Mexican sour gherkins or mouse melons. They're very diminutive cucurbits, and they will grow in a small to large pot. So if you just have a bit of a trellis structure, but don't have room for a kind of billowing, spilling cucumber plant, they're kind of like grape-sized, one-bite cucumbers that have the sort of image of a watermelon.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yummy, yum. And just to make comment that the tomatoes, we want to wait until May to plant them.
Yes, please.
When it gets warm. Okay, not just yet. So, Art, we have another question on terrariums, and they were wondering, what size plants are best to put into your terrarium?
The smaller the better, because it's a tiny space. So maybe a 1-inch pot or 1.5-inch pot, and you bury them down in there, and you leave the orchids in their pots. The foliage plants you could take out and let them acclimate, but by and large, the smaller the plant you can get in there, the better.
Because they will grow.
They will grow.
Yes. Have you ever had to extract a plant from the terrarium? How do you do that?
Sure. If it's not happy, you pull it out, and then you put another one in its place, very carefully.
Very careful.
And the thing goes on.
Oh, sounds fantastic. So easy, so wonderful, and so safe for our pets as well. Pat, we've got Amanda here. She has an avocado pit that she's been growing. It's half submerged in water, and it's a foot tall, and she'd like to transfer it to a pot. Do you have any tips on how she could transfer it to the pot from that water environment?
Yeah, I mean, plant it carefully as you would any seed. You know, as they say, every plant is very unique, but you generally plant seeds 2 to 4 times the depth as they are in diameter or circumference. So just make sure it's under the soil a bit. It's a tropical plant. It gets large. The biggest thing is to protect it from frost. We've definitely started and lost many an avocado, even in a greenhouse when the door got left open just a crack. So they're very tender to frost.
They are very tender, which means none of our frost dates have been met yet. So if you're going to do this, hold tight and keep it in that house a little bit longer, okay? We have another question concerning pussy willow, and it's Louisa. She's here in the audience, and she wants to know the best way to root pussy willow after it puts out those wonderful little hair roots in water.
Hey, Louisa. Oh, there you are. So, that's funny that you asked about pussy willow. That's one of the things I brought today to talk about that's just thriving in many a garden in the early spring. So now's a perfect time of year to root them. Not only do they root easily in water, they are actually the natural highest source of auxin, which is the rooting hormone that can be synthetically or naturally derived. So you can not only just put it in water or put it in damp soil and have it grow. It's practically easier than mint to propagate. But in addition, if you let some willow leaves or chopped up stems ferment in water, a bucket of water, 5-gallon bucket for about a week, you can actually then use that as a rooting potion to water your more difficult to root plants with, like a tree cutting or something like that, and it'll greatly increase your chances.
Good old salicylic acid.
Yes,
So,
aspirin, right?
good old aspirin, yep. Came from willow. We have Trish in the studio audience, and she took out several large trees and lots of bushes, and now she has a lake from all the rain. What should they do? Oh my, I'm so sorry. You've changed probably the grade. You've eliminated those roots to absorb all that water. You've totally changed the environment of your yard. And I'm going to have to say that you're going to have to look into some drainage, some drainage pipe, and put in some trenches to drain the water. The other thing is you can embrace it and dig a hole and make a lake, a pond area. You can do that too. So I think it's what you intend to do with that landscape, whether you want to have it to be a perennial border, a vegetable garden, a lawn, or would be interested into creating a feature. But
Absolutely.
you've definitely changed. You've learned the valuable lesson of what trees and shrubs do and the amount of water that they drink up. So.
Sure. With that Virginia clay, you can really just create a bowl, an earthen pot that's not going to want to drain very well. But hey, cattails and river birches if you want.
I'll tell you the most important thing too is make sure it's not going under your house. So berm up ever so slightly along your foundation to keep that water from going under your house. That's experience talking, okay? We have another question concerning wiregrass. And Georgianne here in the studio audience, how does she get rid of wiregrass? And what's the best non-chemical way to rid a lawn of Virginia weeds? We had on the show a few years ago a company that does organic lawn care. And I don't know whether you live here in the community of Richmond or not, but there are throughout Virginia a number of lawn companies that use organic practices for lawn care. As for wiregrass, it is as tenacious as it comes. I'm a big proponent of trenching, deep trenching, so that the wiregrass, the roots will shoot out, the rhizomes will shoot out into the air and dry before being able to get over to your garden bed. And if you have it in your lawn, embrace it. It's lovely in the summertime when all the fescues die. The wiregrass is right there. You know, it is our name. Sometimes you just have to do that and say, okay, I get it.
Mulch heavily to stay on top of it.
Mulching heavily, and understand. I've found in digging wiregrass to be 24 inches deep. Those roots. Art's like, I'm going back to orchids.
Sometimes I've actually doubted if it was plant or metal. It really lives up to its name.
It does. It really does. So, okay, we have another question here concerning the terrariums, Art. And they were just wondering is, how do you know when do you need to pull everything apart and start all over again?
So orchid growers are always monitoring their plants. They're looking at them, they're touching them to give them signs. Is it happy? Is it not happy? So if you see a plant that's not happy, that can spread, so you do want to pull it out. But it requires vigilance and constantly looking at them just to make sure everything's okay.
Is there ever a time where you just pull the whole terrarium apart and start over again?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And they're so easy to put back together, as you know.
Yes.
Just rocks and moss, and away you go.
And off you go again.
Yes.
Yeah, get some anthuriums. Well, there's some other companion plants to grow in.
Little bromeliads would do nice, or ferns, or tiny little palms. I could have brought those as well. But you can only put so much in a small space.
Exactly, exactly. But in case somebody doesn't like the anthurium, give them some other suggestions.
Certainly.
So, thank you. Here's a question from Lisa. She's always put horticulture charcoal in her rocks, and she's interested if we do or do not. She helped to keep the bottom. Wait a minute. Always put horticulture charcoal in my rocks, and I'm in interest that you do not. I thought it helped keep the water in the bottom from getting murky. Do you have anything to say about horticulture charcoal in the terrarium?
Well, only that we never put so much water in there that it actually stands in water. We sort of just spritzing the top, the mosses, and the surface of the roots, and it never really gets floating at the bottom. So we're not going to have any kind of mildew going on.
I see. And that charcoal would help contain that and
Yes,
control that. Yes. We have Becky from Montpelier. What's the best pot to use for an orchid and an African violet?
Well,
I don't know.
maybe later in the show we'll have an orchid expert to answer that for us.
Any experience with African violets, sir?
No, but orchids all day long. You know, there's plastic pots, there's clay pots.
Yeah.
Plastic holds the moisture, clay lets them breathe. It really depends on what your media is that you pot it in.
Yes, yes, it really does. That makes all the difference. A friend of mine collects African violets, and the soil is what makes it, because you can kill them very, very quickly. So, we have a question here from Henry of Chesterfield. His garden is very wet right now. I am so sorry, Henry. And what is the best time to plant the cabbage and the garden peas? It usually has passed by now, but with all of the rain and all of our gardens being so wet, I know at Maymont we just planted out all of our cold crops about a week ago because it finally dried out enough for us to do so, but we have raised beds. How about you in Charlottesville?
Sure, yeah, you can definitely still plant them, and we just put up an article on the blog about, or a Facebook page about Thomas Jefferson planting several rounds and keeping meticulous notes about when he planted his. So keep planting them, and with the coals, they still are very frost tender, especially if they were grown from seed in a greenhouse. So you might want to keep some row cover over them for the cold nights.
Mm-hmm. Which we're going to have a few more, and then that'll be it.
Yeah.
Well, these are enough questions for now, so I think we get to go to the Orchid Station to learn more about orchids.
All right, here we go.
All righty.
Well, here we are in Barboursville, Virginia, surrounded by beautiful vineyards and forests, and also the family-owned business, the Orchid Station. I'm here with Mark Philauer. Thanks for having us, Mark.
Yeah, most certainly, Patrick.
So how did you all get started in this business?
My dad grew up in southern Florida and would collect orchids from the Everglades with his best friend, and they would establish them in their backyard and really developed a hobby of growing orchids.
Oh, nice. Okay. And how did that lead to a nursery in Virginia?
A jealousy of his best friend starting a Vanda operation in Homestead, and Dad decided to start a wholesale orchid phalaenopsis operation here in Virginia.
Very good, very good. So phalaenopsis is one of the most commonly seen orchids for sale, and there must be some reason behind it that you also chose it. So why phalaenopsis?
Mainly the longevity of bloom. They have one of the longest lasting blooms in the orchid world.
And are they relatively easy to take care of?
Yeah. I recommend benign neglect. That's easiest care. Once a week watering, indirect light, and then basically you go from there.
Very good. Well, let's get into some more detail about that, because despite everybody loving orchids, many people say, I can't get mine to stay alive, I can't get it to rebloom. So what's the watering and feeding schedule that's ideal for phalaenopsis orchids?
Let me start with this. As a lot of people think when the blooms are done, the orchid is dead. And that's not the case. If you have green foliage, you have a live and healthy plant.
Yes.
So when you're done with your bloom, you cut the bloom spike back all the way to the base of the plant, right about here.
Okay.
At that point, you start giving it a fertilization. About once a week, water, and then about every other time you water, you'll do a dilute solution of a balanced fertilizer, where your numbers are about 20-20-20.
Okay.
And with the dilute solution, you're going to fertilize your plant. You're going to give it, during its dormant period, energy to produce a new bloom spike.
And what about the potting or repotting? Because sometimes the roots really expand past their borders.
Yeah, and that is a natural process. The orchid would be in its natural state, hanging from the crook of a tree.
Right.
So those are just its air roots trying to find a purchase on a rock or a tree. And those can be tucked in when you repot, and it is a good practice to repot about once a year.
Okay, very good. Those roots need some time, some space to expand
Exactly.
and to be able to breathe, right? So we're mimicking the natural ecology of them being an epiphyte on a tree branch. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about the potting medium when you do repot it? Does the particular medium or the nutrient quality affect the orchid?
Most certainly, yeah. Most of it depicts your watering schedule. So we grow in a sphagnum moss, which retains a little more moisture and allows you to go a little longer in between watering. Some other growers grow in fir bark, a charcoal medium, but those don't hold as much moisture and you need to water more frequently.
So I see so many orchids in bloom at the blooming stage. How are they when you got them, and where did they come from?
Most of these are stem cell mericlones. They are phalaenopsis can be seed propagated, as well as from a kiki, which is rooting off of the stem itself.
Okay. And it looks like you have an example of a younger one over here. So this one is, over there.
it's
So
right
it
here,
hasn't bloomed yet.
Yeah, so this is...
How old is that orchid?
This is about 2.5 years old. It lived a year in a flask, and then about a year and a half to this point. And from the initiation of its bloom spike to the set of its first flowers, about a 90-day process.
90-day. So being from a tropical environment, really pretty quick growing, faster than they seem to grow when they're in your own home care. So that's pretty cool. So if you were to start it from seed, what would that process be like?
So you would expose the seed into a charcoal potassium-rich, basically petri dish, which would be a flask, and you would expose those seeds, which are part per million, as fine as talcum powder. And at that point, though, they would live for about a year in that flask under grow light, and we would have a survival of the fittest inside the flask, and you'd have about 100 plants, and from that point you would pluck the plants out and put them into a plug tray, and they'd live for about another 6 to 8 months in a plug tray, and then you'd up pot again. And during this period, you want to make sure that your temperatures are warm. 70 degrees is ideal. Never let it drop to 60. 60 is kind of that critical spiking point.
Gotcha. And so is that what you want to get your orchid to rebloom?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And as a home grower, you can put your plant outside, put it in a garage, in a screened porch. You never want to let it be exposed to direct sunlight. Can damage your foliage. But difference in daytime and nighttime temperatures is really what it is, which will then initiate your bloom spike. And that's a lot of the times people think their orchid's dead, it hasn't bloomed. They haven't let it be exposed to those cooler nights. It may be in a climate controlled area, 70-degree, super happy foliage plant inside the house.
Right. What about the pollination of the orchid? Obviously, they're such a showy flower because they have some particular pollination methods and rely on those pollinators. So how would you pollinate it in a nursery?
So you could use a toothpick and pull the pollen cap off, and then just insert it into the flower of a neighboring flower, or even itself.
And so any of the varieties will cross-pollinate?
Within the Phalaenopsis varieties, yes.
Phalaenopsis,
Yeah.
very good. Well, can you tell us about some of the varieties we have here?
Yeah, so this is the Sogo Euclidean V3. This is the main white Phalaenopsis that you'll see. This is another variety called Happy Dancer. This is Golden Apple and Green Apple.
So I noticed a lot of them have a really nice kind of dual tone to them, and when you see them in the light here, their petals and their sepals are sparkling, and they have some very intricate little designs in that lower petal that catches the insect. So they're definitely doing their job of attracting the eye.
Well, and that's the main goal, is to attract the insect. And they're called moth orchids, the Phalaenopsis, and a moth would be its typical natural pollinator.
Okay. Well, what are some of the sort of fallacies and myths you've come across as far as how to take care of orchids that are not true?
You never want to add ice. So that's one of the main questions I get at orchid shows. Do I put ice on my orchid? No, you don't put ice on your orchid. It's a tropical plant. It needs to be watered thoroughly and then dry out thoroughly in between its waterings. And a lot of people don't give it enough water, feeling that you're going to overwater. And also making sure that your plant has drainage.
Yes.
You never want it to sit in water. It'll have wet feet and never be able to dry out.
Right. So very much like taking care of a succulent.
Yeah.
I've never heard it described that way.
Similar. Yeah. A lot of people compare it to African violet growing as well, the Phalaenopsis.
Okay.
Similar light fertilization.
Okay. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time, and it's just incredible being here. It feels like a tropical paradise. I'm ready to set up a hammock. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mark, thanks again for having us out there. I felt like I was back in Miami, where I spent a little time this winter, so it was a really beautiful spot out there.
Most certainly, Pat. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Well, I thought we would start out with something that not everybody gets to see often, which is orchid pollination. We mentioned it when we came out to the Orchid Station, but would you be willing to demonstrate a live orchid pollination right now?
Most certainly, most certainly. Yeah, so one of the tools you would use is a toothpick or something very small, because a bug would be naturally doing it. But so I'm going to come right here with a toothpick. I don't know if you guys can see this.
Okay, yep,
but there's a pollen cap right here where you would grab there and it sticks. And you see there, I have the polonium, which is basically where orchids have pollen all together, opposed to like dust-like pollen. It's all as 2 units.
It's a lot better for people with allergies if they want to have this as an indoor flower,
Most certainly.
Right?
And then so with this pollen, I could go to another flower of, let's say, this variety. So this is a Taisuco firebird, which I'm going to cross-pollinate with a Fuller Sunset. Okay. So I'm going to go into the right under, I don't know if you can see here, right underneath the pollen cap. So there's what's called the column. You want to put the pollen directly into the stigma, which is right there, which is also kind of a jelly-like substance. And then now we've got, I'm staying on, I've got one of the pieces of pollen in there. Now I've got both.
And so they're engineered to be so sticky because they rely on a very particular pollinator coming to them, either for looking like a mate or trying to secure a certain pheromone from the orchid. So they don't tend to produce as much nectar as other flowers, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, and now what we're going to expect is this flower is going to, within the next few days, is going to cave, and then this flower will do the same because it knows that it's been pollinated, and then the eggs of the orchid are actually in the stem coming from the flower to the stem, and that's where your seed pod will, this flower will cave, and then this stem will swell. Over about 6-month period, you will then develop a Phalaenopsis seed pod.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of people would be probably most familiar with a vanilla bean pod, those little specks, right?
Exactly. That's your most common orchid pod that you'd see.
Right. So being so small, we have these millions of seeds that lack an endosperm because there's no space to feed the seed with an endosperm. So they need an external source of nutrition to get started, right?
Sure, yeah.
All right, so how would you do that in vitro in the lab?
So then it would need a charcoal potassium-rich medium. So that would be your substrate that you would grow your seedlings in. So yeah, it would need a nutrient-rich material to grow in.
That's right.
And
So
it's all done under sterile hood as well
Yes.
as in a sterile environment.
Right, right. So you have to provide that source of carbohydrates or sugar or the potassium nutrients to get them started.
Exactly.
Whereas in the wild, how would they find that nutrition?
Through a fungus, a natural fungus.
Yeah. So the whole forest, that's why you can't really transplant and shouldn't ever transplant an orchid from the wild, because they're relying on those mycorrhizal fungi, the tree roots.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So you could do this, but we showed it because it's not something that is often done. So now you can see how you could do it if you were going to be an orchid hobbyist, but more commonly, how would you actually propagate your orchids?
So most all of what you see here are stem cell mericlones. And the process there is where you would take a growth tip from here, or even from the root. You could take a piece of growing root tip, and then you would put that, which has the DNA from the plant, and you would put that with a hormone that would then create a protoplasm ball that you would grow for almost a year. And it's an undifferentiated protoplasm ball, which has just the plant's DNA and not the, it's just basically a ball of jelly. And it grows for a year, and then you divide that up into very small segments, and then you would do the same thing that you would do with a seed. You would sow those little protoplasms pieces into a flask.
Okay.
And then at that point, you would give it another hormone that would differentiate growth for roots and leaves. And at that point, you'd grow for about another 18 months. And then you would pull out of the flask and start potting into a smaller pot, grow for another 18 months,
Right.
and
Right.
you've got a blooming plant,
Baby
a ready to bloom plant.
Right. Now that is fascinating, and although let's now venture into something that someone could do at home, because part of your mission is to make orchids seem less mystified and less easy to kill, because in your opinion, if you know a couple things, if you know a thing or two about their care and about their propagation, it's really a lot easier than you'd think.
Sure, let's go to what we have right here. We've
Okay.
got this, this is a species of Phalaenopsis called Amabilis, and during the summer months, it tends to foliate off of its blooming spike. And we've got right here what's called a kiki. It's Hawaiian for baby. So I'm gonna actually show you right now how to, so as soon as the roots are about an inch long, it becomes a viable plant on its own. And this guy actually last year bloomed twice.
Wow.
So it's an
those two
overachiever.
spikes.
So, and I'm also going to show you that orchids are not as tender as you may think. So they can, this guy's a bit woody due to its growth from last year, but really just, I should have had the cutters. But all right, so we've got right there is a new baby orchid that this guy asexually produced. And I'm going to show you how to repot it right here. So I've got some New Zealand sphagnum moss, which is the medium that I prefer to grow in. So I'm going to take, it's not a tight moss, it's a nice loose moss. So you put a little ball in the bottom, and then tuck your roots down, set it in the pot, and then kind of a loose wrap around. It's a happy medium between tight and not too tight, because you want water to be able to flow through and down and drain out. If it's really tight, it kind of gets saturated, and you don't like that, or they don't like that. So you, a kind of a rule of thumb is if you can pick the plant up and it not fall out, that's kind of a good rule of thumb when repotting your plant. It's tight enough but not too tight. And so there you go.
All right.
There's your pot ready to bloom.
Very good. And so the sphagnum moss not only holds the moisture, and it's just sort of a substrate for this epiphyte to grow in,
Sure.
but nutritionally speaking, does it offer anything to the plant?
It does not. So
Okay.
everything that you so know that it gives you no nutrient. Everything that you give to your plant is what's coming from you. So it's going to need to be a balanced fertilizer. Okay. We talked a little bit about some organic fertilizer possibilities, and some of those would be like a worm casting tea. I've never done it, but if you crush eggshells, it's a good calcium source. So you can put that directly on, or you can also make a tea with that and obviously let it cool and then pour that over.
All right. Mark, thank you so much. Well, I definitely learned a lot here, and I can't wait to learn some more in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Now we're going to head to the tip from Maymont.
Around 1800 is when English ivy was introduced to the United States, and it was used very popularly through formal gardens and in landscapes. Unfortunately, it has run rampant since, including up our trees. And the ivy can smother the tree. It's very bad to have this ivy going up the tree. And the fact that it traps moisture underneath the ivy and actually causes the protective bark layer of the tree to rot and to slough off, which kills the tree. Because you have to understand the life processes of this living organism, a tree, is right underneath that bark. So you have to be careful, and we have to ensure that nothing damages that bark. But as you assess and look at the ivy, these vines can last for many, many years, and you can see how they get larger and larger with age, some of them becoming actually 6 to 7 inches of cross if given the time. Here at Maymont a number of years ago, I started a campaign of attacking the ivy on our trees. And initially we used clippers, and we found that that was really ineffective, and though we switched over to a hatchet. And what we did was we got a nice lightweight hatchet, and we made sure that it was sharp. And that's the important critical piece, is to sharpen your hatchet so it's a nice, clean, sharp edge. And what we do is we start way at the bottom of the tree to start cutting the ivy there. You know, when you have 2,000 trees, you find the most efficient way to do something, and we've learned that chopping away at these vines at the very base is the best way to do it. We want to make sure that we have a nice light touch so that we're cutting the vines and we're not cutting into the bark of the tree, because what we don't want to do is damage this bark at all. And as we chop around, we're also assessing what's going on with the tree, and we sometimes come upon areas such as this where we can see that the vine is growing into the trunk of the tree, and we're going, oh my. So we've got to come on down and look at it. We want to be able to get it right down there at the base, and this is where you want a nice sharp axe so that you can move on. And I always make sure it's free. I make sure that it's definitely disconnected before I move on, and that will kill all of that right there. But you know, again, getting back to my task of very lightly tapping and cutting these vines until I make my way all the way around. People ask, do we pull it off? No, about August it'll all slough off, nice and neat. So get your little axe, get it nice and sharp, and take a few minutes and go out and save a tree. You know, it really is quite easy, and I hope you got that message. It's just so easy to attack this ivy, to be able to get it off of those trees. So we've got a lot of questions. We have a lot of information to share. Before we get going, I just want to make mention that the end of April, the last Saturday of April, the 26th, is Maymont's Herbs Galore and More, and it's at our Hampton Street entrance, and the gates open at 8 a.m., and the event closes at 4. During that event, I've been partnering with the Department of Environmental Quality, and Maymont is going to be the site for the launching of the new native plant guide for the capital area and for the RVA area. So we're excited to be able to have this native plant guide put together by local professionals to give people some ideas on new things they can try in their gardens. And speaking of some of our native plants, you've got some edibles here, Pat, right?
I do. Actually, many of them are not native, and referring back to the question about the weeds and what to do with them. So put down your mulch, make sure you stay on top of the weeding, but eat the weeds if there's something that's edible and nutritious. So right here we have some chickweed. Most of you have seen it, might love it or hate it, but it has that flavor reminiscent of green beans. Dead nettle, purple dead nettle, it's in the mint family, and it to me tastes like raw mushrooms. So I think better as a pot herb added to soups. We have its look-alike, the henbit, and then we have some hairy bittercress, which has these flowers that are blooming white right now, and that's going to give you that kind of mustard green type flavor. So go ahead and eat up, and keep your eyes out, since we won't see you till the end of April, for morels, red buds, violets, so many wonderful things to eat.
So many yummy things.
Black locust flowers. I like to make a flower power salad with the violets, red buds, locusts, and put a little coconut and coconut vinegar. Can't beat it.
Can't beat it. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, sir, so
All right.
Thank you. It was fun. But you didn't mention the daffodils. No.
My stomach hurts.
Right. Our first question is from Steve, and he's here in the studio audience, and he's got a Vanda orchid that sits on his desk, and it's been in the vase for 2 years, and He waters it weekly and feeds it monthly. How do you get this to bloom again?
You want this one? You want me to take it?
Start. Go ahead.
All right, so Vandas, if it's on your desk, it may not be getting enough light. They really require some high light as well as regular feeding. And a practice that I recommend is even filling a spray bottle. And also, if it's in a vase, that's not typically how I've seen Vandas grown. Usually they're in a basket with open air roots, sometimes in a clay pot with some larger coconut pieces, but they like to have a lot of drainage around their roots. That may be a problem, maybe just a new environment, but squirting it with a dilute solution of fertilizer quite regularly could get you some new blooms. And also you need to be pushing new leaves. It's going to bloom off of where your new leaves come out of. So if you're pushing new leaves, that's how you're going to get it to bloom.
So it blooms off of new growth.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All righty. We have another one from Belinda at Glen Allen. In the summertime, can you put your orchids outside in a tree and watch the tendrils grow down? Has anybody done that?
That's the best, the way to grow orchids in Central Virginia is to put them outside. From May to September, they've got the humidity, the air circulation, the warmth. They feel like they're back in the jungle. So that's the secret really to get orchids to come back.
How do you get them back in then though, guys?
So one quick thing I want to make sure that people know, they do not want to be, depending on the variety, Phalaenopsis, which I think a lot of people are growing, they do not want to receive direct sunlight. So that you can really damage your foliage if you expose it to direct sunlight.
Well, think about it. It's an understory species.
Yep.
Yeah,
You know, it's got an understory species with a very thick canopy.
most certainly.
So, got to think of where it comes from. Sandy from Facebook, she has a small orchid that she had rebloom once, story of my life, and can't get it to bloom again. Any advice on how to get that small orchid that she had? That's tough because, Sandy, we don't know what kind of orchid it is. Let's just say it's a Phalaenopsis, okay?
All right.
Good guess, because it's the most common sold. All righty,
So
Mark.
their trigger for Phalaenopsis is a difference in daytime and nighttime temperatures. So they really need to feel that cool night, about a 20-degree swing. So if you got a 70-degree day, you want a 50-degree night. And that's going to be the trigger for about a week-long period. And I recommend, if you have a screened-in porch, set it outside. Even a garage, it doesn't even need the light as much during that period. It just needs to feel those cool temperatures to initiate the bloom spike.
Interesting. Thank you, guys. Jill from Facebook, how do you know when to water the orchid? She has plural, orchids. I mean, she has more than one, so.
Well, generally speaking, we don't want orchids to get bone dry, crispy, or they start to dehydrate and their leaves collapse. So we want them damp all the time or just on the cusp of dry. Then we thoroughly water them with warm water, no ice cubes, as Mark mentioned. They're from the jungle. They like warm air, warm water, everything warm.
That's a good way to do it. And you know, when they get dry, the veins kind of really puff out and they get very desiccated. I know that look very well. My houses are always dry.
So back to that reblooming question, I have had a lot of people ask me if and when to cut the flower spike down. Do you cut it all the way down? Is there a method to it?
There are, and there's a few schools of thought. Some people cut at a growth node and get another side shoot. You may get 2 or 3 flowers additional out of your bloom spike, but I like to give the plant a dormant period. You cut it all the way back, give it about a 3-month dormant period. That's when you start your fertilization, and then you'll get a full new spike. So I cut all the way down to the base of the plant as soon as it becomes unaesthetically pleasing to me.
Okay, sounds good. Elizabeth from Henrico, she has a house orchid, and it sometimes gets little bumps, which she thinks are an insect. How does she get rid of it, these bumps, and not the orchid? And when does it come? Yeah. When does it come from being in the house? Where does this insect come
So
from?
the bumps are probably brown armored scale. You touch them, they do feel bumpy, and so you usually have to loosen them with a cotton ball or rubbing alcohol and sort of get down to the surface of the leaf and spray it regularly once a week with rubbing alcohol, maybe every week for a month, and that gets rid of them.
Pure rubbing alcohol or
Pure
diluted?
rubbing.
70%. 70%. So, but it's pure. It comes out of the bottle just like that, but it is 70%.
Straight out of the bottle.
Straight out of the bottle.
Pure
at
70%. Okay.
And you
Just
can
had to
spray that
clarify.
directly onto a flower, a blooming flower, and
Of
it
an
won't harm
orchid,
it.
huh?
Yeah.
You put that on a rose, it's dead. Only for orchids, okay?
If you don't know what we're talking about, consider yourself lucky because that scale will go from house plant to house plant and get so sticky. Oh,
Yeah, and
terrible
check your
stuff.
pots. They harbor in pots.
Yes, sometimes it's take the orchid out, take the growing medium out, clean out the pot, sterilize it. We used to, the old school was put it in Clorox for a little bit to definitely clean it of all organisms and then replant.
Freezing is another good way to get rid of
Put it
it.
in your freezer.
Baking is another way.
Baking, unless it's plastic, don't go
Unless it's
there.
plastic.
All right, Susan from Henrico again. She thought she was supposed to put the orchids in pine bark, and you all are advertising sphagnum moss.
So different substrates will depict your watering schedule. So there are some fir bark orchid mediums. We grow in sphagnum moss. That's just our decision to do because we water less frequently. It retains a little more moisture. I also think that my roots are very happy in sphagnum moss. But most certainly, if you are used to growing in bark, you can continue growing in bark. You're just going to need to water a little more frequently.
Personal choice.
Now the pine bark may be a little acidic though.
Yeah.
So fir bark, if
Fir
we
bark
did
is-
bark, we would use fir. But sphagnum really is the media of choice for orchids these days.
I'm learning what I'm doing wrong here, so keep talking, guys. Angie on Facebook, different question. We're talking about moss in the yard. She lives in Goochland, and she has a massive amount of moss growing in her front yard with very little grass now growing. And how and what can she use to get rid of the yard of this moss? This is a really easy one because what you need to do is change the conditions by taking a soil sample and making sure that the pH of the soil is actually more neutral. And because your pH is very low, it's very acid, the moss has a wonderful environment to grow in. You'll find that as you raise the pH by adding lime, according to the instructions from the soil sample, that's the key, then you'll find that the moss will diminish and that you'll be able to actually add some compost a little bit on the top, and then you'll be able to plant some grass seed. It's going to take you a season to adjust this, but go right ahead and start right now. And you can send the soil sample up to a local garden center or even to Virginia Tech. So just give it time. You'll get that lawn that you're looking for, okay?
We can use that moss in orchid terrariums.
They can use them in the orchid, absolutely. Very good. Somebody here, Celia wants to know how to trim the hydrangeas. I know it's springtime. I'm pulling up the hydrangea question because I know it's an important fact. And real briefly, you've got to know which one you have. When you find out which hydrangea to have, you'll find out how to trim it. So we're coming down to the last minute of the show. We're excited to have everybody. Really quick, I wanted to say thank you and to have both orchid experts on the show, one focusing on terrariums, one focusing on propagating orchids, has been a joy because this is a topic so many people needed more information on because it is a plant that we all love. And some of us just have problems growing. You know? So I want to thank you, and we'll see you next month here on Virginia Homegrown for our second show of the season. And I thank you. And because we have a few more seconds,
Sure.
alrighty.
I can tell you where we're going in
Where
April.
are we going next
Yeah,
month?
so we are going to the private garden of Nomi Bear. She is a hydroponic creatress, so she makes very innovative hydroponic structures.
Okay, that sounds like a good thing, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Funding for Virginia Homegrown is made possible by Strange's Florist, Greenhouses, and Garden Centers, serving Richmond for over 75 years, with 2 florist shops, 2 greenhouses, and a garden center, located throughout the metro Richmond area. Strange's, every bloomin' time. Wild Birds Unlimited, providing bird food, feeders, and garden accessories. Products to enjoy nature in your own backyard. New location next to Wegmans in Midlothian, and also at Pump Road and Three Chopped. And by the Nanchard Morganson Charitable Fund.